1, 2. Good evening, everybody. We're here finally. Yes, we are. Thank you. Just needed a copy of my notes. Good to see everybody tonight. How's everybody doing? It was a late go tonight. I don't know why. First time I've got here and nobody was here. It was rainy and cold, and thought, man, everybody's going to stay home tonight. And now here you are, your beautiful, bright, shiny faces. But everybody doing well? You don't have to spread out. It's just me. But tonight I want to answer one of the questions that was kept coming up quite frequently in our discussions. And it dawned on me, Nadine mentioned to me that we've got next week. Is next week Thanksgiving?
No, the following week.
Okay. So we have next Wednesday night, and then we have a break for the holidays. I didn't realize. So we've got one more week. I'm going to let you a multiple choice what I'm going to cover on that last one, and then we might continue. So, since last week, we have a new president, and now we have a new ambassador to Israel, and we have a new we have a new Secretary of State and a new Secretary of the Defense. So is that anything? Yeah, just kind of interesting. Well, they're not appointed. You're correct on it. They're not in the job yet, so that won't happen until January. But that affects the peace in the Middle East. Remember last week I was talking about just kind of the whole, I think, evangelical Christian motivation and guideline behind the movement of Zionism and to go back. And I don't know how well you guys know Mike Huckabee, the governor. He was a former pastor, and his perspective is very much what I was talking about. Evangelical, I would say dispensationalist, sees the modern state of I'm going to try to quote him directly. I'm going to paraphrase his quote, but it's the same, is that he believes that the modern state of Israel has the deed and the title to the entire land of Israel, including the places that are currently occupied by Palestinians. He takes groups over and he says, I'm just throwing this out there. I'm not pro or against this. I'm saying, what do you think about this? He says that there's words he won't pronounce. He will not say out loud the West Bank. He doesn't believe in such a thing as the West Bank. He says that all just belongs to Israel, and so he won't say that. He doesn't call them settlements. He calls them neighborhoods. And so it's, I don't know, right or wrong. Maybe you're on that side, but that's a pretty big change, yeah. And he and Benjamin Netanyahu know each other pretty well, and so interesting. Marco Rubio is going to be the new Secretary of State. I don't know much about his. I think he's pretty strongly in support of Israel. So, which the current administration has been too, although, sometimes they debate back and forth, but as far as U.S. support of Israel, it hasn't really wavered. So interesting. Well, I wanted to talk about where anti-Semitism comes from. You guys, have you ever experienced or dealt with anti-Semitism in your neighborhoods? See, this is a phrase that I'm not familiar with. I have to be taught these things because I grew up in Vancouver, Washington. I might have had Jewish friends, but I don't remember any. I have had Jewish friends as an adult, and I get along fine. And I just don't have that. There are some places that grow up, like in New York, where there's a lot of Jewish people, that's an ethnic issue and things that people have had to deal with for a long, long time. But I just haven't. The only anti-Semitism I know about is what I see on the TV or on the news or read in the history books, because I I don't really understand it. Some people say, well, it's a natural outworking of the Christian Bible. I said, well, is it though? Do you think there's any, is there any outright anti-Semitism in the Bible? Anybody can think of any? Huh? How about any subtle anti-Semitism? How about any nascent anti-Semitism, like just the seeds of it? It's not quite there. So my answer to that last one is I can kind of see it. I don't think any of the writers, by the way, all of the writers of the Bible, both Old and New Testament, were Jewish. So they're definitely, Old and New Testament, there are prophets that, as an internal critique, right, for a prophet to look at his own people and say, we need to get our act together. And definitely the prophets during the exile said, the reason you did this because you're idolatry, that's why they conquered you. So that's kind of, but I don't know if that's anti-Semitic. Can it be anti-Semitic if it's just an internal critique? It's kind of hard to talk when it's one-sided, isn't it? Sarah, would you reach over there? Do you know where the preach button is on there? On the lights, off to your left. Just on the lights, up in the upper left-hand corner, there's a little button. Hey, look at that. And now you're perfect. Now I can see you all. What do you think? I began to notice just a little while back, and I think what changed my mind is understanding the history of when the Bible got written. So far as I can tell, most of Paul's writings were before the war in 70 CE, or AD, however you like to call it. And my guess is that the Gospel of Mark was written just before it. It doesn't appear that the Gospel of Mark knows that Jerusalem's going to be destroyed, but it seems very obvious to me that both Matthew and Luke do know it. So they're writing stories that happen in 30 AD, but they're already aware of the war in 70 AD that destroyed Jerusalem. I think that lends a little credence to some of those verses that some people say are anti-Semitic when the Jews all say, may the guilt of this be on our family and in our children, you know. It's a little different to know, well, that story already kind of knows that Jerusalem was going to be destroyed. Yeah, Marty. You've seen a lot of anti-Semitism in downtown Portland? From who? People that are what's the source of that? And why is there hatred for Israel, you think? Huh. Just flat out shouldn't exist. So it's not necessarily support of Hamas or the Gaza Strip. They just carry that trope that they shouldn't exist. And they're talking about the nation of Israel itself. We talked about the modern formation last week. Interesting. Anybody else?
Well, there's a lot of backlash for what's going on in Israel.
Yeah, like what in particular that's going on? Like the war with Hamas?
And if you listen to the news reports and everything else, the genocide is
Yeah.
on Palestinians right now.
Yeah,
You know, all the 40 or 50,000 dead.
yeah.
So,
And it's so hard to get the numbers. He's talking about the numbers of the people that died. I don't know if the word genocide is applied to it yet, but it definitely is by the detractors. And once again, genocide is, nobody ever agrees about when to use that word. But no, I understand. No, it's been used a lot whenever you have tens of thousands of people that are being killed, and it's a difficult thing. So there are some people that are protesting Israel's strong reaction to Hamas and how many people have died. So yeah, these are modern conflicts. But so I brought some notes tonight, and one of the great challenges, I set out to say, maybe I could find 4 or 5 of the leading causes of anti-Semitism, and I could have written 5,000 pages. It is impossible to narrow it down, and even just to give you a bullet statement of like the 5 or 6 historical events, or the 500 or 600 historical events that have led to it. And the different places. Can I just say that throughout history, people have hated the Jews. They have hated Israel for different reasons, and most especially since the time of the Jewish War in 70 AD. And on why that's a turning point is because it destroyed Jerusalem, it destroyed the last temple, it destroyed the priesthood, and it really destroyed the form of religion that the Bible knew. Both Old and New Testaments did not exist after 70 AD. And so even before the completion of the Bible, that form of religion was over. Never to be heard of again. Now that doesn't mean that there isn't Judaism, but something else was birthed after that. I have a chart. Want to see a chart? Do I have a verse tonight? Read this with me, would you? There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free. There is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. If you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. So according to the book of Hebrews, all of us are heirs according to Abraham's seed. Some people have a problem with the Christian doctrine of secession or replacement theology, where all of the promises from the Old Testament now, because we've got the New Testament, those promises all get inherited by the church and taken away from the Jews. And when I read verses like this, I don't see a replacement, I see an inclusion. I see a combination of Jews and Gentiles together in the grace of the Lord. And so, but that is a source of conflict. So let's go to the chalkboard. Look at it. All right. This is all for you guys. Drew this all just this afternoon. I was thinking of you. In the Second Temple times, which was about 439 BC until 70 AD, when the Romans destroyed the Second Temple. So the first one was destroyed in 538, and then they built the second one after they returned from exile. And so we called this period a lot of times Second Temple Judaism. And by the way, before they came back from exile, the word Jew wasn't really a word. They weren't called Jews, they were called Israelites or Hebrews. And you know, you had the northern kingdom of Israel and you had the southern kingdom of Judah. So they might have been Judahites, but when they went back into exile, when they came back, now Jew was not a nationality, it was an ethnicity. And the 12 tribes were really not distinguished very much. There might have been some people that happened to know their ancestry, but you weren't split up into your tribes so much anymore. And you don't hear a lot about the tribes after the exile. So that was kind of a pre-exile type of thing. When they came back, they were just Jews. Now you did have Jews and Samaritans. And Samaritans were kind of a remnant of the northern kingdom left over and intermarried and kind of a cousin of the Jews that returned. And we find out in Ezra and Nehemiah that they had clashes. And so ever since they came back, there was opposition. But so Josephus tells us that there were three main political parties in and around Judea. So Judea is the name that the Romans used for the province. We call it now Palestine or Israel, but it was during Jesus' time it was called Judea. And the ones we hear about in the Bible most of are the first two, the Sadducees and the Pharisees. And so these were both descendants of very old orders. The Sadducees were descendant from Zadok the priest, and who was anointed in the Old Testament. That's where the word Sadducee comes from. And if you could compare it, kind of an analogy is the Sadducees were the Senate and the Pharisees were the House of Representatives. They were a little bit lower class, but more academic. So the Sadducees were like the senators and the rulers, a little more secular. And it was from the Sadducees that the high priest was chosen. And so they were the ruling class. They were aristocratic ruling class. And for all of these generalities, there's probably exceptions, but that's kind of the general rule. So when you hear about Caiaphas, the high priest, and Annas, his father, those were Sadducees. The Pharisees were the other side. They were the ones that were more inclined to read the scriptures and to study them, from which the scribes came. Sometimes the scribes were Pharisees, sometimes they were, from another class. I don't know how many of the Sadducees became scribes, but scribe was the one that would reinscribe the scriptures and the holy texts. And Pharisees also, some people wrongly think that the Pharisees are always the bad guys in the Bible, but they're not. There are some very good Pharisees. So there were two schools of Pharisees in the day, Shammah and Hillel. And Hillel was one of the more, for a better term, was the more progressive. And Shammah was the more legalistic. So when you hear about clashes between Jesus' disciples and the Pharisees over picking grain on the Sabbath or something, that was probably people from the Shammah category. When you hear people like the Apostle Paul, or like Nicodemus, or like Joseph of Arimathea, was he first? The other one was Gamaliel the elder in the book of Acts. So Gamaliel was descended from Hillel. And so these are the guys that stand up and speak in favor of the gospel, or come to Jesus and talk about being born again. This was the more progressive wing of the Pharisees. And so when the Apostle Paul comes along and is preaching salvation by grace, it's not that nobody was saying things like that. Jesus' gospel and the gospel of the Apostle Paul, that they weren't completely out of left field. There was a softer school of Pharisees that were very receptive to his teaching.
Are you born into Pharisee or Sadducee, or do you choose?
How do you get to be a Pharisee or Sadducee? Yeah, I would guess a lot of it is hereditary, but I'm not sure I know whether you can join. I would guess by and large in the Sadducee field, it's something that you're born into, but that'd be a good, interesting topic to just look up. Yeah. Charlie.
Are the Pharisees, or the Sadducees and the Pharisees, are those political appointments or are they religious appointments?
Yes. They said, are they political or religious? There was no separation of church and state almost anywhere in human history until the United States and France. But yes, very political and very also religious. So the high priest was either appointed by the king, who was appointed by the Caesar at the time, and he had religious duties, but how much of a person of faith was the high priest? I don't know. We know that the high priests were there casting their vote against Jesus, so it's hard to tell, brother. And at some time during the 100-year reign that led up to the war in 70, when the Romans took over, I've read down through the whole lineages of sometimes they had a king of Israel and a high priest. Sometimes the king appointed the high priest. Sometimes the high priest appointed the king. Sometimes the king was the high priest. And then the last straw was the two factions couldn't decide who was going to be the next high priest, so they asked the Romans to settle the matter, and they never left. So, but it's a whole hodgepodge. So when Jesus came along, needless to say, were they more religious or political? So it wasn't like there wasn't any religion in this, but remember one time in the book of Acts it says that Paul started a dispute because he knew that the Sadducees didn't believe in things like angels or resurrection, and the Pharisees did, and so that was some of their belief. So it was religious, but it was also very political too. It's also very much about control. And so go figure, when Jesus came along and turned over the money changers' tables, that was the Sadducees. He was kicking the power structure in the teeth and saying, this is supposed to be a house of prayer and you've turned it into a den of robbers. Along came a third party that's not mentioned in the Bible. They were called the Essenes, but Josephus mentions them. Josephus was a Jewish soldier that got captured by the Romans and then changed sides and became a recorder for the Romans. And even died in Rome with the name Flavius Josephus. Flavius was the dynasty of Titus and Vespasian. So he was the recorder. But what's fascinating about him, and he's such an enigma because he's such a weird, where did he come from? and how did he survive. But he records some of the most amazing history outside of the Bible. And you can't always tell whether he's telling the whole truth, because there was no objective history in the ancient world. It always had an agenda. But this is just from his description. He said there was a very prominent third party called the Essenes, and they lived up by the Dead Sea. They're the ones that saved the Dead Sea Scrolls for us. They lived up at Qumran, and they had utterly rejected the first two. They said this is corrupt. They believed and thought that the glory of the Lord never returned to the second temple, that the high priest was illegitimate, that the whole thing was corrupt. And I've been there in Qumran in July, and it was 135 in the shade. But they had pools all over, which is very unusual in the ancient world, not for bathing, but for ritual bathing. And so they were very strict in their lifestyle, in what they ate and what they did. They very much were into keeping scriptures and sacred writings and baptizing one another. And some people see a little bit of familiarity there, or similarity between them and John the Baptist. But there's also differences, so that's just kind of a theory. So the Essenes were monks, and they were into baptism. And then the fourth category, Josephus doesn't remember, I'm just going to call them Galileans, but that's kind of just my word for it. And this was, like the Essenes, was another kind of a splinter group, like a faction that began to believe that this man from Galilee was the Messiah that was promised. And they began to follow him. Those are called Jesus' disciples. And so I call it just kind of the Galilean sect. So this was kind of there were more than this. There were radical factions of like the Essenes and the Pharisees. There were zealots, and there were Sicarii. There were hitmen that would go and stab people in the back to oppose the Romans. But all of this changed in 70 AD when the war happened. And when the Romans came in and sacked Rome in 70 AD, that was the end of the Sadducees. They killed off the high priests, ended it, burned the temple to the ground. Josephus says that Titus didn't want them to burn it, but they were just so excited by the time they got in, he couldn't help it. Who knows? And also we don't hear about the Essenes. Well, they lasted for a few years, more like 73, because that's about the year that they went up to go and get the zealots out of Masada down at the Dead Sea. And on the way back, the Essenes hid all of the scriptures in clay pots. And we didn't find them until the 1940s. So what an amazing thing. A Bedouin shepherd was chasing his goat on a cliffside and fell down through a hole and fell on top of a pot and discovered the most amazing discovery of 2,000 years. A whole cache of ancient scriptures on animal skins, including an entire copy of the book of Isaiah from 300 BC. And before that, the oldest copy of the Old Testament that we had was from 1080. So that was just amazing. So they got destroyed. So what lived is this. So you think about, where does Judaism come from? Where does Christianity come from? It was almost as if why did I want to use a Star Wars illustration right there? They're like the Luke and Leah. The mother died on the table, and two twins were born from her. Biblical Judaism died on the table of Jerusalem in 70 AD, never to be resurrected again. And what was birthed were two twins. One carried on the tradition of rabbinic Judaism. So it's basically the descendants of the Pharisees. And you say, which ones? The good ones or the bad ones? Probably a little of both. Probably a little bit of the legalism, probably a lot of the teachings of Shema and Hillel. Hillel was the one that was responsible for, if you love your neighbor as yourself, you fulfilled all of the law. Jesus even, that's where the golden rule comes from. That was a Hillel saying. But these survived. And so not only did they have the Tanakh, you know what the Tanakh is? It's the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim. So it's our Old Testament. Except if I'm a Jewish person, I don't call it the Old Testament because it's not old, it's the Bible. It's the Tanakh, it's the Bible. And they also had, from about 200 BC, they had a companion book, not a replacement, but a companion called the Talmud, which means the teaching, and it was just the collection. So for hundreds of years, it was just oral, passing on what Hillel taught and what Shammai taught, and how they interpreted scriptures. So sometimes they were commentaries, sometimes they were just anecdotes and stuff. And they wrote this down over time. There's the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud, and they became kind of just a companion teaching to the Hebrew Bible. Well, another sect that was born is a group of people that I call Messianic Jews. So you had rabbinic Jews that followed the teachings of the rabbis, and you had Messianic Jews that followed the teachings of Jesus. And so really, at the beginning, it's not Jews versus Christians, it's one group of Jews versus another group. Have you read in the New Testament? Everywhere they went, that Paul met in synagogue. Jesus says, that the gospel comes first for the Jew, then for the Gentile. That they begin to argue about that time. Do you have to be Jewish to be saved, to be Christian? And the Apostle Paul's gospel was, no, the gospel is now for everybody, both Jew and Gentile. And he'd say, even though I'm as Jewish as they get. It was taught by Gamaliel and the Sanhedrin, all of those things. And so eventually, down through the centuries, this became Judaism and Christianity. But one of my questions I have a lawyer that helped to do the will for my mother, or her estate, and he's a Jewish man. Not that here in the middle of Vancouver, to be a stereotype like that. I said, well, so I was just talking to him, and he found out I was a pastor, and he goes, the only problem I have with Christians, I wish you would just leave our stuff alone. I said, yeah, but you don't realize your stuff is 80% of our stuff. We can't just ignore all of that. So what is anti-Semitism? I did a little deeper dive, and I learned a couple of things this week. I learned more than that, but a couple of the big takeaways this week is anti-Semitism is supposed to be one word. Now, even when I started the notes a couple weeks ago for this, I put a hyphen in it. So there are Semitic languages, including Arabic, including Ethiopic, including Syriac. They're called Semitic languages. They're part of a group. And so it's not to be anti-Semitic, like anti-people that speak Semitic languages. To be a Semite is a pejorative word that was coined in Europe later on. It's kind of to some extent, it's kind of an artificial distinction. And it was meant to be derogatory. And so to be anti-Semitic doesn't mean that you're against the Semitic language. So the word Semitic comes from the descendants of Ham, the descendants of Shem, as opposed to the descendants of Ham, who are the African people and the Egyptians, and then the descendants of the European nations, which later on in Germany would be called the Aryans. And so those are the three branches. But those three branches are an artificial construct. They are not a strict or a scientific ethnic divide. So those were actually kind of words that were made up to be against Jewish people, but it's still around. So when we say anti-Semitic, we mean anti-Jewish. We're against Jewish people in particular. And so it began, we have the destruction of Rome in 70. I kind of talked about that. And the birth of the two daughter nations. A number of early Christian fathers, even at the very beginning. Justin Martyr, John Chrysostom, Cyprian. It doesn't take long for the Christians that survived the destruction of Jerusalem and ended up being on the right side of it, to look at the destruction of the temple and of the priesthood and see that as a sign that God's favor was on the Christian side and that it was the fault of the Jews, that they were responsible for the death of Christ, and that's why the bad things have happened. And friends, honestly, there are people that still think like that today. Exactly just like that. And so I asked if there's any seeds in the Bible. Well, whenever I see it, I don't see it a lot in Mark. I see it some in Matthew and especially in Luke. And then when you get the Gospel of John, John just calls them, and then the Jews did this. It's not the Pharisees and the Sadducees, or earlier passages say, then the temple leaders came and did this. So it's not just a few guys. Then the Jews came. And part of the way that I can explain that is, I still don't think that John was being anti-Semitic. I think it was just, now he's preaching to a Gentile audience, and he's trying to explain to them who it was that did all of these things, and it's just too much of an explanation to say they were Pharisees and Sadducees, because they don't know what that is. She goes, these were the Jewish people at the time. So it began like that. But there's some of those phrases, just because of that, I don't think John meant it as to be against Jewish people, because he himself was Jewish. But there's a little bit of that polemic and it was all their fault, retelling the story, that you can't ignore once you even look for it. There's a little bit of a seed of that became something bigger. So that's my answer to it. I don't think the Bible presents a case or argues for being against Jewish people. I don't think you can make it. The Jewish people were God's chosen people, and then if anything, we as Gentiles that believe in faith in God, we've joined them in their faith, not against them, not to destroy them and replace them, but we've joined them. It's just the families become bigger. So in about 325 AD, Constantine, who is now the emperor of Rome, became Christian. So instead of persecuting, he became a Christian, and he was very much, he wrote things. I read a bunch of his writings in the last week, and he wrote a lot about the Council of Nicaea, and said, they argued about whether or not to do Easter. And some people said they should do it just like the Jews do it, and some people said they shouldn't, and he wasn't a big fan. He didn't make Judaism outlawed, and he never really made Christianity the official religion of Rome, but he made it an acceptable religion and kind of gave it preference. It wasn't until Theodosius in 438 that began to establish Christianity as the one true religion, and so anything else, you were less than a citizen. So being a part of Rome meant that you were a Christian, and if you weren't, then you didn't have rights. And one right after another, first you couldn't marry anybody outside of your religion, and then you couldn't hold certain jobs. The Justinian Code in 534 stripped them of many of their rights. And then comes Martin Luther, and you think, well, during the Protestant Reformation, surely one of the things that the Protestants will do is right the Catholic Church prejudice against Jewish people. And Martin Luther gave us some wonderful gifts. He gave us the doctrine of sola scriptura, that everything comes from the Bible. He gave us the gospel of sola fide, which means that we're saved by faith alone and not by works. He gave us the doctrine of the priesthood of the believer. It's not about priests, but that we're all priests. He's the father of the Protestant movement. And if we're Protestant, if you're not Catholic today, you owe some lineage to Martin Luther. Martin Luther was also something else. He was also very German and very anti-Semitic. And there's no way around it. I know I have a very good friend who's a Lutheran professor, and even in the 20th century, the Lutheran Church has gone back and made huge strides to apologize for the areas where Martin Luther was just flat wrong. And he wasn't a little bit, it wasn't just like he didn't eat Jewish food. He actually wrote a book called On the Jews and Their Lies. And where in one place he said, we're all at fault in not slaying them. He considered them to be the murderers of Christ and at fault. Isn't that strange that a lot of our most greatly held Christian doctrines introduced to us by a guy that couldn't escape some areas of his hatred and his bigotry? There are no perfect people. So we can learn from that, but because of that, I've become aware, and maybe just this lesson tonight will help you become aware too, when you hear those little prejudices come up in things that we just take for granted that those are just Protestant ideas. And we don't hear how anti-Jewish they are. You know what I'm talking about? We had an Easter play a few years back. I don't remember if Tom did it or not. It was a great one. We get all our plays from like the same company, right? So we don't really have, and they're very evangelical, probably Southern Baptist, good Christian, solid Christian. You could probably play these plays in any Protestant church in America probably and be just fine. But I hadn't listened to all the videos. And it got to this one place. There was a woman who had, I don't know if it was the woman caught in adultery or something, but she was going on in her testimony. And then she goes, and then those Jewish leaders, blah, 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 and just got really angry. And you could just tell in the tone of her voice, it wasn't like, it was like, there's a little bit of, we could have toned that down a little bit. So throughout European history, they would do things called passion plays, which is one of the reasons the Passion of the Christ was so controversial. And it basically was like a reenactment of how the Jews killed Jesus and blaming them. And at one point, there was another false accusation made against Jews called the blood libels. Have you heard of this? And I don't know where the myth started, but the myth started that they would drink blood. It's not true. Even sometimes the blood of little children. And it was kind of like in a mocking ceremony of the Christian Eucharist. It's not historical. It's like the Salem witch trials, but blood libels lasted for thousands of years. Think about the ancient world. They didn't have the internet to look up if something's true. They just heard it from somebody. And so anyway, questions so far on that? Yes? Yeah, I don't know who started it, Charlie. Yeah, something like that. It was kind of like a mock. I think it was kind of like in mocking the Christians. It just was one of those rumors that got started that wasn't true. But yeah, something like that. It was, the accusation was they kind of have their mock kind of Eucharist. But anyway, so some of the other forces. Any questions so far about anything? Does that disturb you that I said that? It was disturbed me a little while back. I discovered one of my favorite lexicons is written by Gerhard Kittel. And I don't know if you knew this, but most of the great Protestant theologians are German. In fact, back in the day, you went to seminary, you went to learn Greek and Hebrew and Latin and German. So much so. So much of our theology is German. We're very German. I've said this before. Why is Jesus' name spelled with a J? Because of the Germans. Jerusalem, Judah. There's no J's in Hebrew. They're all Y's. Whenever you see a J, that's the letter Y. Why do you spell it with a J then? Because that's how Germans spell the letter Y. Yehuda. Yavo, spelled with a J. So that's why all those words, we're very, whether we like it or not, we are very influenced. Our Protestant Christianity has a lot of German mixed in with it. And with that, I think we need to watch out for times where it's a little overly, that the point of the story is that the Jews were terrible and they couldn't get saved. Everybody in the Bible was a Jew. You with me? Sometimes we'll get into that. The extreme version of the gospel was that the Jews were legalistic and that didn't know about grace and didn't know about love, and it's all about law. But now Jesus, the gospel sets us free to where we're just saved by grace. When we got the Dead Sea Scrolls, we began to realize there were a lot of Jewish people that understood about grace and love. And so it wasn't entirely that lopsided. But there's a little bit of that Christians versus Jews that can creep into our gospel if we're not careful and if we're not aware of it. I try very hard not to go like that. In fact, several years back, I tried, and I still do it, but I tried to stop calling the Hebrew Bible the Old Testament, which as a Christian, that's just how we grew up calling it. But that's kind of like we've got the Enlightened Testament and you've got the Old Bible of the old, the legalistic Bible. And if you know anything about me, I spend most of my mornings having my devotions in the Hebrew Bible. That was Jesus' Bible. And it's beautiful. There's lots about grace and love. And to me, the New Testament in some cases is just the Cliff Notes. It's explaining what the prophet said and interpreting it. Jesus quoted from it a lot. And so I call it the Hebrew Bible. And call the New Testament the Christian Bible or the New Testament. That's fine. But any other questions? What was I saying about Gerhard Tittle? Gerhard Kittle. And there's a shorter version called the Little Kittle. Any Bible college student knows about these books. And he's responsible for teaching most of the world what all those Hebrew words mean. He's also responsible for quoting the phrase, the final solution. I had no idea. My heart sank when I found that out. Like, I've been reading that guy, so I just, man. It is, so just be aware. Would you do that? Would you join me in just kind of putting up your ears when you hear people start to talk about that? Never forget that Protestantism was invented by Germans. And not just World War II, even back in the Reformation time, in Germany, the whole landscape was very anti-Jewish. And so just rethink it. Rethink it. Any other thoughts? Have you noticed anything like that? Yeah, Jeff. That's it. Jeff said, how could Martin Luther get so much right and get that wrong? That's a great question, because Martin Luther, the Reformation is one of the most transformational events of human history. And he was the leader of it, and it wouldn't have been possible without him. Have you ever read Martin Luther? He was a nasty person. He was not nice. He would have made Donald Trump blush. I'm just telling you, in his polemic. People talk about, all I meant by Donald Trump was that he can be very brash or very open in his attack, more than most politicians. Martin Luther was like, the Pope called him like a wild bull. He was just untamed. When he didn't like somebody or he was against them, he was not nice about it. He would call them names. He would make fun of them. He was, yeah. And in the midst of it all, God used this person to completely change the world, Jeff. It's a conundrum. If you've never read books about Martin Luther, I would suggest it. It's a fascinating read. I'm not entirely sure he was mentally stable, Jeff. I mean, there are stories that we'll tell anecdotally about him, in his place where he's translating the Bible, that he'll look up and be in constant fear of the devil and of condemnation, and look up, and there's a spot in his house where you can go and visit, and there's an ink stain on the wall, and the story is that he threw the inkwell against the wall as he was aiming at the devil. I'm like, oh, okay. That's it's a little intense. Yeah. It's interesting how throughout history, God has used many of the great men and women in church history. You read long enough, you'll read things that were really off or imbalanced about them. None of them are perfect. And I think we can learn from their mistakes just like we learn from their positives. Yeah. Same with Christopher Columbus or George Washington. They didn't get everything right. Yeah, yeah, sister. Yeah. Yeah. Totally, yeah. Yeah, I think that I've had that same thought, sister. That's really, really, really good you pointed it out. What she said, if you couldn't hear, I'm going to repeat because people that are watching online can't hear unless somebody wants to hand around the microphone, but I'll just repeat it. She says what's amazing is that Martin Luther, as he was translating the Bible and not going back to the beginning, he used, in a lot of cases, Erasmus's text and different ones to translate the Bible into German, which hadn't been done yet. But he ran out of time. One thing that that's amazing to me is, the most brilliant theologians and the people that really have some important Christian thought, you only have a window in your life. And that's why I'm impressed by a guy like Adam Clarke, who single-handedly wrote a commentary on the entire Bible. That took him like 40 years, but I love Adam Clark. He's a Methodist preacher, and every once in a while, a little anti-Semitic. And I say the same thing. How can he get so much right and still see? It's really hard, Jeff. It's like people that lived during the times of slavery. You say, how could they get so many things right and then have slaves? And for some people, it's hard to separate what's culturally there and think outside of that. But, yeah. Any other thoughts or questions?
How does hatred of the Jews become so systemic and worldwide and outside of Christianity as well as inside of Christianity?
Oh, that's a great segue to the next topic. Love it. He said, how does it become so systemic and worldwide? Jeff? Okay. So there's a couple other major areas. But I'm going to talk about two of them. There are books that go into greater detail than this, the 10 sources of anti-Semitism, the 5 sources. There's several great articles on Wikipedia that I was to glean, and that's when I began to realize I was swimming in the ocean to try to figure out where it all came from. But a couple of the things, one of the most common tropes that we have today, even in most cultures, is the economic version of it. And in many prejudices, and in many prejudices, whatever it has, there has some seed in a certain social economic situation. And so in the Middle Ages in Europe, because of the prejudice against Jews, in a lot of places, remember, like I was saying, Charlie, the local bishops were the governors. It wasn't they didn't have separation of church and state. So it was political, you were political. And so a lot of times Jews weren't allowed to have certain jobs. They were limited. And so some of the jobs that they gravitated toward was banking, accounting, and money lending. Now this is an interesting thing in the Hebrew Bible. It's not permitted in the Hebrew Bible to loan to your fellow countrymen and charge usury. But it's okay to do that for a Gentile. And so this became one of those tropes, we call it, right? An anti-Semitic trope that's kind of a generalization or something, that it had some seed in reality. If they're always the ones coming to collect the rent and they're the money lenders, well, just in general, Jewish people kind of got a reputation for being greedy, materialistic, cheap, hard negotiators. I was shocked at myself. I have about a dozen racist phrases that I was taught growing up that I didn't realize were racist until I was an adult and started thinking about what does it mean to get your, I don't want to say any of them. I never realized what the phrase cotton picking hand meant. Like, get your cotton picking hand off of my toy. I thought it was cot pick, and I heard it growing up. I didn't know what that word was. And it wasn't until later that I realized, wait a second, is that talking about an African American person? I'm like, oh my goodness, I can't believe that comes out of my mouth. I didn't mean that. I was talking to my brother. And the other one was, I used to say this all the time, when you go and talk somebody down on a car, you're going to go and Jew them down. I didn't know it was J-E-W. For some reason in my brain, it was like D-J-O-U. I thought it was some weird word, like chew them. In fact, I thought it was like chew them down, right? Like you chew at them. When I finally discovered, I was so embarrassed. I said, you mean I say Jew them down? I said, I hate that's ever come out of my mouth. But sometimes we just have to unlearn what we've learned, right? But that's still in our culture, that Jews are, they're in charge of the banking world. They're greedy. They cheat non-Jews for their benefit. All of those things. There's a character in Shakespeare called Shylock, who's a moneylender, and he becomes the evil person. A lot of medieval plays. And a lot of Grimm's fairy tales. The Jews are the bad guys at the end of the day, and That's just a part of that culture. And I think it's important to be aware of it, and look if there's any part of our vernacular or any part of our tradition that's still like that. One of them that exists in the United States is, and it's come up in recent years, is in our country, what are other areas of that Jews are known to have a strong hand in? Diamonds. And there's some truth. I told you about that. The diamonds come from South Africa, and then they get cut in Jerusalem, in Israel, and then they get shipped over to New York. That's kind of the diamond triangle of the world. So when I was looking for my wife's diamond, I was going to all the diamond stores in the mall, and it finally dawned on me one day that they all have Jewish names. And I had to learn that because I didn't grow up hearing those names being Jewish. I just thought they were stores, but what else? The what? Real estate. Hollywood. It's still very famous, and I think Mel Gibson got in trouble for saying something like that when he was not in a good state. But famous for being in Hollywood. You think back to Metro Goldwyn Mayer, a lot of those grandfathers of Hollywood were Jewish, and so you can start with generalities like that, and then that's when prejudices come from, and even people that are in charge of banking today. And so you asked how it becomes systemic. Well, if the Jews are in charge of the banking system and the money, and if the prejudice line says that they're greedy or they're corrupt, then that becomes a slippery slope for Hitler to say the reason we're having economic problems is because the Jews have been in charge. You understand? It becomes easy to scapegoat somebody like that. And that's what it was. After World War II, Germany was very devastated and impoverished. And it just took a little while before people began to be very bitter, and a charismatic leader like Hitler came along and blamed it on the Jews. But that prejudice was already very long established. So once again, to go back to our friend Martin Luther, and Hitler was no great Christian believer by any means, but at the Nuremberg rallies, he had a copy of On the Jews and Their Lies Under Glass. And so he used that as propaganda. So the third one is racial anti-Semitism. So there were all these laws that limited Jews from being able to hold certain positions or to have equal rights. And sometime during the what they call the Jewish emancipation in the 19th century, followed by the Industrial Revolution, more and more nations began to give Jewish people equal rights. And so because of that, they gained more economic mobility, social mobility, and people began to have a problem with it. And it's not entirely because of this guy, but I found a writer named Arthur de Goben. I don't know how to say that in French. How do you say that? Anybody speak French? I'm going to say de Gobenau. I don't know. Posited a theory that there was a Proto-European race called Aryans, which is a phrase that was coined. That's not an actual ethnicity. They are Proto-Indian European. And they were genetically superior, distinct from other subgroups like the hypothetical Caucasian race. So that would be people from the Caucasus Mountains. Friends, these are not exact ethnicities. These are socio-political words made up to describe white people and non-white people. And then that they were genetically superior to the Semitic races, which basically is Jewish people, and to the Hamitic races, which is the black people and the Arabs and the others. And this is a part of the foundation, you might know, for the Nazi philosophy of the superior race. Friedrich Nietzsche posited the Übermensch, the Superman, although strangely, Nietzsche also wrote a lot against anti-Semitism, so it's kind of hard to peg that one down. But anyway, so there was just some race. So even the word anti-Semitism is kind of not the fact what it is it's talking about an ethnic slur. Nazis controlled Europe during World War II. Assidicides were classified as Aryan, were privileged as a master race, and non-Aryans were legally discriminated against. Jews, Romas, Slavs, including all the subcategories. So what do you think? I got a couple of questions for you tonight. You ready to have discussion time? Yay, let's have discussion. Find a group of 3 or 4 people, and I got a couple of questions. I'm going to end with this. So I put some verses there. Matthew 27 says, all people answered, his blood is on us and on our children. This is called the blood curse. It's called down famously. And so who is Matthew talking about? Not all Jews, but he's talking about that generation. And I got to think that was written at a time that Matthew knew that the city of Jerusalem was going to be destroyed. So this is kind of tying it in. In 1 Thessalonians 2, it says, you suffered from your own people the same thing that those churches suffered from the Jews who killed the Lord Jesus and the prophets and also drove us out. And so there's this verse. It's problematic just on its face. It blames the Jews for killing Jesus. And up in Thessalonica, they had just clobbered him. And so he was reacting against those particular people, the Jews that lived in Thessalonica. But then there's places like John 4 where Jesus says, we worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews. And as far as the gospel is concerned, they are enemies for your sake. But as far as election is concerned, they're loved on account of the patriarchs, for God's gifts and call are irrevocable. So he said, when God chose the Jewish people, he never goes back on his word. And in Romans 9, he says, the people of Israel, theirs is the adoption of sonship. Theirs is the divine glory, the covenants, the receiving of the law, the temple worship, and the promises. Theirs are the patriarchs, and from them is traced the human ancestry of the Messiah, who is God over all, forever praised. Amen. I love that verse. So he's talking about, listen, we may not be of the same modern religion as the Jewish people, but their tradition is our tradition. Their God is our God, and they are the people of the book. And anyway, I hope I gave you some food for thought. And I have a couple of questions for you tonight. What's the place for Jewish people in the plan of God today? Where do they fit in with it? Are they still the people of God? Are they only the people of God if they become Christians? Do they follow after Jesus? Where is the place for them prophetically today? And in what areas could Christians get better in their attitude towards Jews? Or are there? Maybe we're doing just great. But I don't know, you've seen some college protests and stuff. Are there some areas that can still be improved on? What do you think? Take a minute, grab 2 or 3 friends and just think about these for a while. We've got about 15 minutes left. And before you're done, pray. Would you pray for peace in the Middle East? And then next week we're going to have our last one. Talk about in your group, what do you want to spend the last Wednesday night on, too, by the way?